In this episode of Contracting Conversations, we're talking to Peter Guinto, President of Government, Defense, and Aerospace for Resilinc, about the weakest links in our defense supply chains. We'll discuss the challenges of sourcing raw materials and learn how Peter prevents communication breakdowns between vendors. I'm Scott Williams, along with my co-host Jim Valley, coming to you straight from our booth at the NEXUS 24 conference in Jacksonville, Florida. We're in Jacksonville, Florida at the NCMA/NEXUS conference, and very pleased to be joined by Mr. Peter Guinto from Resilinc. And he's here to talk to us a little bit about supply chain management, risk management, his presentation that he provided here at the conference. So what can you tell us about the subject, Peter?
Yeah, so we kind of start out at a really high level. The big takeaway is that supply chains in this day and age are incredibly complex. So we really talk about like economic factors, like the way that the government of China is investing in supply chains, primarily focusing on manufacturing, while the U.S. economy has taken a much different approach. So there's a lot of talk in the Department of Defense about venture capital, trying to be more like a VC firm, primarily to access new technologies. But at the same time, VCs typically in the U.S. have not invested in production. So less than 1% of investment dollars from VCs between 2010 and 2020 went to manufacturing. The vast majority went to software. Non-capital intensive investments provide a better return on invested capital. And as a result, we've had very little investment in manufacturing in the US, while China has had a ton. So that kind of coupled with some other factors. So horizontal integration. You guys probably have seen through your careers as defense contractors went from true manufacturers with materials and subcontracting being less than 40% of their total direct costs to the point it is today where it's greater than 70% on most programs. That kind of horizontal integration has happened everywhere. So now instead of one company making your thing, it's one company buying from many companies, buying from many companies. So that horizontal integration trend, coupled with global diversification in the supply chain, has really led to these massive, enormous supply chains where many companies can't keep track of all the vendors that support them. I provided the session with some examples. One large aerospace company who's a client has 16,000 tier 1 vendors, and they have 120,000 tier 2 vendors, ballpark. So for the government team who's buying from this one company that really looks at this one company's risk in most instances, the vast majority of your risk is actually with those sub-tier vendors who outnumber them hundreds of thousands to one. So that was the kind of the core focus of, hey, most of your risk comes from sub-tier vendors. Most of that risk that's built up over time has been out of the control of the prime contractors. And really there are macroeconomic effects that government buyers need to start contemplating to make sure that they avoid supply chain risks.
And we've talked like flow down clauses. I'm sure contractors, that's a risk, just making sure we have the flow down clauses. But also, a lot of people talking about, hey, let's bring all this manufacturing back to the States, maybe certain items. Yeah. But that is not as easy as they think, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so it's much harder than anyone thinks. So I got, in my government career, I had the fortunate opportunity to work some Defense Production Act Title III work. During the COVID task force, we were investing a whole lot of dollars in a whole lot of ways. So microelectronics and rare earth minerals go into ventilators, go into medical products. So those were some key investments that were made during the time. My next job after leading those teams, I was the chief of contract for unmanned systems for the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And one of the first things that I tried to do in the business management reviews that I held with my big prime contractors, and there were 5 of them, was make sure that these sources we're investing in as a nation get utilized in my supply chains. So we were ready to bring funding. If there was going to be an increased cost to make sure it was a domestic supply chain we were relying on at a low tier, we were ready to do it, but we couldn't. Not because the contractor wasn't willing, because the contractor didn't know where these things were coming from. So most things in the stuff that we buy come from commercial vendors And most of the time, they don't know who exists at tier 2 or tier 3 or tier 4. So although we'd all love to do it, we were unable to because supply chains weren't mapped out the way that we needed them to be. So that is, my opinion, a huge challenge that we face. So as we invest more and more money into Defense Production Act Title III, creating raw material sources of supply, which are predominantly our biggest problem when it comes to reliance on China, we need to make sure that we've mapped out our supply chains and that the folks that are down in the low tiers are actually using those sources of supply, or they could go away. So one thing we've seen over and over again as a nation, we saw this with COVID for sure, but pretty much every big natural disaster or shortage of healthcare, in particular, equipment or materials, there's this bullwhip effect where companies start investing in the production of something. So they create supply, but when demand doesn't follow that supply, companies go out of business. They stop making those things that were, created to, respond to the problem in the first place. So I think we face a big risk there.
And I think there's a lot of challenges in DoD specific, but we're talking challenges throughout multiple, many industries. Like cars, autos, when it comes to those chips, right?
Yeah.
So now they're trying to bring it back so they lower the risk. Maybe not 100%. Right.
So I think most of the commercial clients that I work with and my company works with outside of defense and aerospace, they're mapping supply chains out for a host of reasons. Primarily, it's to create operational efficiencies. Right. So the best example I give is if you have a tier 5 vendor and they have a problem and they can't deliver on time, they're not going to tell the tier 4 right away. They're going to try to fix it for a couple weeks. And then the tier 4 vendor finds out about it, and then they might try to fix it for a month. So this just repeats itself.
It's a ripple effect all the way up to the prime.
Yep, you're playing the telephone game.
Yep. So before you know it, 6 months have passed.
Yep.
You finally find out.
And now your mitigation solution is suboptimal. So a lot of commercial firms have gotten ahead of this by mapping out their supply chain, by monitoring their whole supply chain. So now when something happens at tier 4 or tier 5, I know about it right away. So my fix is cheaper, it's more timely, I preserve revenue, preserve margin. So lots of these companies are mapping out the supply chains to create operational gains, but also lots of them are looking at something that's commonly referred to as a China plus one strategy. So COVID was a real eye-opener for a lot of commercial companies that the geopolitical risks that come along with China, the strict control over the entire economy by the centralized Chinese government are a big risk. So they're trying to diversify their supply chains. So I think there's a good chance in the commercial area there'll be some success. What I worry about is that we need to make sure that our defense dollars do the same thing. We need to be early adopters because these companies we're investing in, they're going to face everything that we see with a company that starts production. Right? There's going to be learning curve. There's going to be, costs up front that they're going to have to spread out long production lots. So the more we can feed their demand early on, the better the chance of them succeeding long term.
Yeah, kind of very similar to performance-based logistics, where we want to give the contractor a longer period of time that they can move all those costs, spread them out for the whole time, because they're going to invest. We want those contractors to do the same thing.
Absolutely. Yep. And we want to keep them alive. We want our investment in capacity to be an enduring investment. In the past, it hasn't worked out that way many times.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, with the theme of the conference here at NEXUS is working together in teams, understanding the different disciplines, how they come together, and the relationship between, the government and the prime contractor and how important that is. And I think going back to your example of some of the enormities of the tier 1s and then going down, what a big task that is for a prime contractor to manage that, because with the government we don't have the privy of contract to be able to reach down past the prime. But that's a big task, and some contract management is vitally important in how they manage those tiers, and that communication, as you were explaining, from the lower level tier up through, and the effect it can have, it can be enormous. So I think that's really important to, as you mentioned, focusing on that relationship and how important it is down below those other tiers, and making sure that they're managed and that communication is occurring, because it can have an effect on the whole process.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the big pushes that I make in this area to all the acquisition professionals we talk to, right? So NEXUS is a great event because it's bringing program managers and logisticians and financial managers and contracting people all together at the same time. But most of those folks are focused in the acquisition world on one thing, and that's getting the contract awarded. They spend the vast majority of their time on the front end. Most contracts, and big contracts at least, get handed off to DCMA, and DCMA manages the performance. But what the folks in the front end need to start concentrating on is, my goal is not a contract award. My job is delivering the end item or service that I'm contracting for. So, although you don't have privity of contract with those low-tier vendors, there's no such thing as privity of information, right? You can seek the information out on your own, and you can work with your entire supply network to make sure the right things happen at the right times. One example. So I got in the good fortune to work in a couple places where I got to do a lot of continuous education, and there's a course at UNC that focuses on contractor finances. So like defense contractors, going through their financial statements and seeing where they're investing money, seeing where they're operating efficiently or maybe inefficiently, and ultimately seeing what they're trying to get after. And one of the big takeaways from that course was that most defense contractors carry very little inventory, like almost zero inventory. My personal experience is when we were doing production lot buys, the contractors didn't get any inventory until the contract was signed. If we wanted inventory, we needed to invest in that inventory ourselves and then hand it to the contractors, GFE, and those long lead items that we would invariably buy, then shorten our delivery cycle. But as we're monitoring supply chains for clients, when we sense an issue that's happening to a supplier from a prime, that's when the government can step in and say, hey, we need to invest in some inventory here now. Right? Getting ahead of big disruptive issues, which everybody thinks about COVID, but it could be simple as something as like a factory fire, a big storm, or a regulatory thing that's going to impact the marketplace.
Right, and I think the issue is, we're really into just in time, and not just buying that material, but there's got to be a place to put the material.
Yeah,
and they've kind of squeezed their
places to store it. It's costly to keep it in the inventory for a long period of time before it's used. Because then you've got to, in some cases, shelf life or whatever, but you've got to maintain it. Like Jim said, you've got to store it, which comes with a cost. So sometimes
So for the defense primes, since they don't have to carry inventory to satisfy their user demand in a timely fashion, they don't. So, for a commercial company, carrying lots of inventory with the carrying cost is not the right thing, but you want to optimize it. Zero is almost never the answer in optimization. So that's
right. Plus, you have the diminishing, what do you call it?
DMS.
Yes.
Diminishing manufacturing sources. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's obviously a challenge, especially with older pieces of equipment too.
Yeah, for sure.
But I mean, you got to have people that's kind of focus. And we always laugh about, it's exciting to develop the requirement. It's even more exciting to do the source selection, develop the act plan and source selection plan, all that kind of stuff. It's not as fun to deal with the contract administration part when that is the three-legged stool there. That is critical. If you don't do that right, none of the other stuff matters. You could get a great contractor, and it's not going to matter because you're just not administering the contract like you should.
Yeah. And I mean, as we saw during COVID and other big supply chain disruptions, that's where the majority of the risk actually lives. It actually lives in the performance of the contract. So the risk for the government, that is, that's where all of our risk lives, making sure the thing actually happens.
Okay. Well, Peter, last question from me is for the folks attending the conference here at NCMA NEXUS, what would be one big takeaway you would like that your listeners would leave after listening to your presentation?
Yeah, the biggest takeaway is be more proactive. Right? So being proactive in mapping out supply chains, being proactive in monitoring for potential problems will fuel your reactive response. The more proactive you are, the more risks you can mitigate or eliminate up front, and the better your response will be when something happens, because something will eventually happen.
Yes.
And so I would expect more resources probably need to be put into this area.
Yeah, I think this is one of those challenging areas where there is a big return on investment, but there is an initial investment. So getting past that first part of the adoption curve where You got to invest in doing things proactively. Will pay off handsomely in the end, but you just got to get past that first phase.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, sir, for coming on to the show. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was a great talk. Appreciate it.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
All right, for those viewers out there, please, if you can, smash the like button, and either on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or DAU Media, and definitely subscribe so you can get notified of future podcasts. See you next time.